The conviction of neonatal nurse Lucy Letby has been blatantly unsafe since at least the 4th of February 2025. On that date, a panel of international experts who have studied the full case notes of infants who were treated at the County Chester Hospital where Lucy Letby worked found no evidence of the supposed crimes of which she has been convicted. They instead found a catalogue of poor care and medical errors coupled with infants that were much more unwell than was portrayed in court. But that isn't the only problem with the medical information presented in court. Dr. Xu Li, who is Paediatrician-in-Chief and Director of the Maternal Infant Research Centre at the Mount Sinai Hospital and an Associate Member of the Lunenfeld-Tannenbaum Research Institute, has not merely questioned an important aspect of the science used in court, but discredited it to the point where it now has no foundation whatsoever. This is particularly significant because Dr. Lee was the co-author of the sole paper used to diagnose air embolism in court, the central accusation made by the prosecution. Primary prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans has claimed that he used 18 studies in deciding on his hypothesis, but the most fleeting examination indicates that none of these were referenced in court diagnostically, nor in the Court of Appeal verdict. Only one of the other papers even references venous air embolism, and when other studies were cited, it was for the most ridiculously superficial and trivial reasons, such as one paper that referenced screaming in infants. Furthermore, all of these papers address the accidental introduction of air, and Dr. Evans has provided no material explanation, let alone clinical evidence, for why this had to be introduced deliberately rather than accidentally. Other problems with air embolism include the fact that the major diagnostic criterion of skin discoloration has been very obviously misinterpreted and wrongly cited, while discoloration should only occur in 10% of air embolism cases. In the Lucy Letby case, it was cited in 93% of collapses, which is effectively statistically impossible. The insulin testing used in court has been demonstrated to be completely unreliable. Key forensic testing was never conducted, and the evidence presented in court doesn't meet basic and established guidelines of biochemistry. Another critical aspect of this is that the information presented in court regarding decoupled insulin and C-peptide levels was based on adult endocrinology. It is now known, based on new research by the top experts in the world, that this decoupling is demonstrably normal in neonates, and the court heard what was misleading and erroneous information. It should be emphasised that there are numerous other problems with the insulin cases and evidence used in court, particularly the logistics of what supposedly occurred, and the fact that Lucy wasn't even on duty to hang out the bags that she had hypothetically poisoned. Indeed, the feeding bags that were supposedly laced with insulin were neither retained nor tested. Returning to the panel of international experts, this is comprised of numerous world-class experts at the absolute apex of their professions. There are now 33 experts ready to give evidence in Lucy Letby's defence, and this panel has systematically trashed all of the scientific evidence presented in court. Numerous members of this panel are not only credentialed and highly regarded experts in neonatology and paediatrics, but they are also prolific authors of academic papers with tens of thousands published between them, as well as being heads and in some cases founders of authoritative neonatology organisations, institutions and bodies all over the world. It is particularly interesting to compare their evidence with what was presented in court, as the forensic and surgical nature of their work becomes very apparent compared with the tangled web of what primary prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans presented in court, which is hardly surprising. Dr. Evans indeed hasn't worked in a hospital for nearly 20 years at this point, has never qualified as a neonatologist, has authored very few academic papers and almost none in recent years, and is essentially absolutely nowhere near the standard of the panel. The evidence given in court by Evans was, at best, specious, and his conduct since the trial has been nothing short of extraordinary. The international panel massively outranks anything that was part of the court proceedings, and it should also be noted that most of the expert witnesses in court provided either virtually nothing or literally nothing at all to support the prosecution case. There were also numerous known mistakes from experts during court proceedings. These included bizarre comments made regarding the insulin cases and exogenous insulin, which are simply demonstrably incorrect. Major mistakes were made with regard to antiphospholipid syndrome. There were numerous examples of so-called experts missing critical incidents and then conceding this in court. One such example being vomiting events in the case of child G. Assertions were made in relation to child O, which are also demonstrably and very obviously incorrect. And of course, the entire diagnostic foundation, the most important pillar of the prosecution case, is fundamentally wrong. The primary prosecution witness has changed several of his diagnoses since the court case ended, not to mention during the court case itself. This is undeniably true, as he told mainstream media publications that he had done this, but he still later denied it anyway. It's also important to understand the true context of what was occurring at the Countess of Chester Hospital. There were all manner of bacteria circulating on the unit that were never acknowledged in court. These include Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Stenotrophomonas multifilia. Both of these bacteria are potentially lethal for premature low birth weight vulnerable neonates. The World Health Organization recently placed Pseudomonas on its list of the drug-resistant bacteria most threatening to human health. The condition of babies on the unit was completely misrepresented in court. Healthcare professionals almost universally agree that the jury was misled with regard to the condition of infants in the court case. There was irrefutable evidence for infection in virtually all infants involved in the case, and to discount this, as Dr. Dewi Evans did in his so-called diagnoses, is simply untenable, considering that there were 11 other deaths on the unit during the period of Lucy Letby's alleged crimes. When one assesses these deaths, the clinical picture of those included and not included in the court case is virtually interchangeable. Yet the jury heard nothing of this. They didn't even hear about the other deaths whatsoever. Countless medical errors were made on the unit. These include the incorrect insertion of a needle and horrific ventilation blunders in the case of child O, doctors accidentally allowing crucial monitors to be turned off in the case of child G, countless errors related to monitoring and administering of antibiotics and basic hydration, medical mismanagement of the tension pneumothorax in one instance, various mistakes with intubation. These were chronically evident in neonatal notes, continual failures to insert catheters in more than one instance, again a very evident problem. Basic failures with the insertion of the endotracheal tube, another very evident issue. Major failings with resuscitation and ventilation, yet another very obvious problem on the unit. Failures with the activation of alarms on the unit, failures to recognise signs of bacterial infection, failure to recognise and treat necrotizing enterocolitis, failures to recognise and respond to bowel obstruction, critical in both infants C and P, failures to arrange post-mortems for some infants, indefensibly, certainly with regard to child E and child D, delays in recognising respiratory distress, inadequate medical mismanagement of hypoglycemia, inadequate numbers of appropriately trained personnel, lack of training for assigned nursing roles, inadequate staffing, work overload, poor plumbing and drainage resulting in need for intensive cleaning, poor environmental temperature control, difficulty in finding a doctor when the need arose. This is what an example of this that is emblematic of this problem is the fact that they only did 2 ward rounds per week when they should be doing 2 ward rounds per day. Congestion at medication cabinet and preparation trolley, lack of appropriate facilities for sterile preparation. It's clear as well that some high-risk infants who should have been born and cared for at high-level institutions were born and cared for at the Countess of Chester because of a shortage of beds at high-level facilities where they should have been admitted. There were also delays in the transfer of sick infants to high-level facilities when the need arose. This is a major issue as it's clear that the Countess of Chester was inadequately resourced to deal with even infants requiring level 2 care, when actually many infants in the indictment against Lucy Letby required tertiary or level 3 care. Additionally, there was an extraordinarily high percentage of multiple births among the indictment infants, nearly 60% compared to the 1% that would typically be expected. This is important because twins and triplets are far more vulnerable than other infants. Just one way in which the way that infants were presented in court was highly misleading. Other issues were also prevalent on the unit. Medical histories were incomplete. There was a failure to consider the obstetric history, a major issue across the court case as a whole, along with a failure to consider the maternity history of the infants. There was a disregard for surveillance warnings about infectious bacterial colonization, misdiagnosis of diseases, critically important as it's the most fundamental medical error that you can make, caring for patients that were beyond their designated level of care. As mentioned previously, unsafe delays in diagnosis and treatment of acutely ill patients, poor supervision of junior doctors, poor skills in basic medical procedures such as the insertion of chest tubes. This was particularly important in the case of child H, regarding which the prosecution case was literally farcical. Poor management of common neonatal conditions such as hypoglycemia, lack of knowledge about commonly used equipment in the neonatal unit such as neopuff and capnograph, lack of teamwork and trust between healthcare professionals. And I know for a fact that there were multiple errors for every infant. There were also major failures with testing on the unit. This includes, but is not limited to, failures to conduct follow-up testing in the insulin cases, no testing for conditions noted by the expert panel, such as for enterovirus, failure to recognise dangerous bacteria circulating on the unit, such as Pseudomonas and Stenotrophomonas multifilia, no genetic testing conducted whatsoever. All of these mistakes and issues on the unit were overlooked by the paediatric consultants who were supervising both paediatrics and neonatology, who instead spent 2 years focused on the supposed guilt of Lucy Letby. Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam would later be centrally involved with the police investigation, selecting cases and defining the parameters of the investigation, even uncovering critical evidence. They were later described as the golden thread in the investigation, despite being essentially the accusers of Lucy Letby. There will be more on their role later in this video. This has been greatly criticised by many, including Sir David Davis, who delivered an authoritative rebuke of the Cheshire Police investigation when speaking in Parliament on the 26th of May 2026. This prompted a feeble and deeply inappropriate response by Chief Constable Mark Roberts, which was then summarily annihilated by Davis. Returning to the court case, anecdotal evidence used by the prosecution has long since been revealed to be worthless. The supposedly suspicious diary entries cited by Cheshire Police have been revealed by nurses to be known nursing acronyms. There was never any meaningful content cited from Lucy's diary anyway. Text messages used in court are benign and uninteresting, revealing nothing of any substance whatsoever. Even Cheshire Police admitted this. The prosecution attempted to suggest that Lucy was somehow seeking attention from a doctor because she was having an affair with him, but were unable to present any evidence in support of this whatsoever. There was no evidence even of mild flirtation, and messages displayed in court even contradicted this basic premise. Much was made of handover sheets being found in Lucy's house during the court case, with the explicit suggestion made that these were kept as trophies. In fact, it is known that Lucy had kept one handover sheet only in a keep-safe box, and it was completely unrelated to the case, being the handover sheet from her very first shift, which was 5 years before the indictment period. Other sheets were found in bin bags in a garage, having been obviously discarded. Less than 2% of sheets recovered were related to the actual collapse of infants. A so-called confession note was clearly not a confession note and was instead a counselling exercise written on the instruction of Catherine de Bager, an occupational health representative at the Countess of Chester, who later submitted a favourable account of Lucy to the Thirlwell Inquiry. The name of Catherine de Bager is also written all over other notes recovered from Lucy Letby's Cheshire home, while a blue post-it note that wasn't presented in court also contains statements that are clearly exculpatory and which clear Lucy Letby. The statistical case used in court, which is fundamental to the prosecution, has now completely collapsed. Even leaving aside the science, there is literally no way of showing that Lucy Letby was present for these supposed crimes. Lucy Letby's so-called constant presence was referenced throughout the court case. Without it, the prosecution case is literally without foundation, as there is no concrete evidence against Lucy Letby, and thus without this coincidence theory that is at the heart of the prosecution, literally anyone on the unit could have committed these alleged crimes that obviously never happened anyway. It is known that Lucy was not present for numerous collapses, and even when she was present, there were often many other members of staff around, making the alleged attacks logistically impossible. Multiple statistics professors have stated that the chart has no scientific, statistical, or mathematical merit, and statisticians Professor John O'Quigley and Professor Alexander Coward have both stated that the chart could be engineered to make any nurse on the unit appear guilty. It is now literally evidentially impossible to say that Lucy Letby is guilty, as the shift chart is the only thing that identifies her as a culprit. No one has seen her commit any act. There is no concrete evidence. The entire circumstantial case rests on this discredited shift chart. Alarmingly, we now know that primary prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans asked about the location of a nurse during his medical investigation, after consultants at the County Chester Hospital had prompted the police to believe in the concept of a nurse suspect. This is concerning, as Evans does not need the information about the location of the nurse. His job is to assess the medical notes. We also know that the dates and suspect were fed to Cheshire Police by Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam, and the police then proceeded to limit the investigation to this suspect and these dates in a circuitous process that inevitably resulted in Letby being charged. The police investigation was so grotesquely incompetent that it would be laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. In statements submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry, every single nurse who worked on the unit with Lucy Letby indicated that they had no suspicion about her whatsoever, and none of them had observed anything concerning. Furthermore, several of the nurses indicated their belief in Lucy Letby's innocence. Two of the more notable statements submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry from nurses were authored by the anonymised Nurse Y, who was given this name for the sake of the court case, and Janet Cox. Nurse Y had been asked about the monitoring of the unit by CCTV and stated that, "I do not believe there has been physical evidence to prove criminality by Letby, and although incubators were in close proximity to each other, it appears there were no crimes observed." Janet Cox stated that, "I had no concerns or suspicions about Lucy's conduct. She was an exemplary nurse who is completely innocent of all the alleged crimes." The observations of these two nurses are typical of all those who worked at the Countess of Chester. In accordance with this, the case had indeed arrived at Cheshire Police with no evidence. This was stated explicitly by the constabulary in its own internal documents. The police would never have launched an investigation without the intervention of paediatricians Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam. They identified Lucy Letby in a meeting with Cheshire Police on the 15th of May 2017. As mentioned, Breary and Jairam then went on to select both dates and cases for Cheshire Police. This has prompted strong criticism of the Cheshire Police investigation, not least by Dr. Steve Watts, a highly experienced police investigator who authored nationally used guidance on investigations of murder in healthcare settings. But that wasn't the only mistake made by Cheshire Police. Having contacted Professor Jane Hutton in order for the statistical expert to conduct a statistical study on the Countess of Chester, it is now known that the CPS instructed Cheshire Police to cease the work of Professor Hutton. This is another decision that has been criticised by Dr. Watts, as it runs contrary to established police protocol, and Professor Hutton has spoken of this incident in an interview on my channel. Additionally, Cheshire Police somehow managed to reverse the swipe card data used in the court case for 9 infants involved in the case. Furthermore, the prosecution failed to account for another entrance and exit from the unit, which did not have a swipe door, literally rendering this entire portion of the court case completely worthless. The prosecution made several mistakes in court, and on more than one occasion Lucy Letby had to actually correct incorrect statements that were made by prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson, who even acknowledged these mistakes in court. The prosecution literally pulled key evidence used in the case out of the ether. 2 examples of this relate to swipe card data and Datex information used in court. When Datex information exonerated Lucy Letby, the prosecution, without any evidence whatsoever, suggested that it had been fabricated. When it could be made to support the prosecution case, they cited it as being reliable. In the case of swipe card data, there was a surreal moment in court when Lucy pointed out that swipe card records placed her in a certain place at a certain time. Nick Johnson, prosecuting, stated that Lucy could have sneaked in behind someone else without swiping, which of course literally applies to every single instance of swipe card data used in the court case, much of which the prosecution attempted to cite as being accurate and unchallengeable. We now know from emails revealed by Unheard that Dr. Ravi Jairam gave a completely misleading account in the case of Child K, having previously indicated that it was important for the consultants to pique the interest of the police. At some point, the prosecution alleged that Lucy Letby had called a doctor to attend an infant when a child had collapsed because she was supposedly infatuated with the doctor. What they were asserting there was that Lucy Letby should not have responded to a medical emergency. Of course, if she hadn't responded, that would have been held against her instead. The jury heard virtually nothing other than the specious theories of Dr. Dewi Evans and various people from the hospital explaining that they had no idea what was going on, which in many cases was due to their incompetence and lack of knowledge. The court didn't hear about the pathology reports, they didn't hear about the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health review of cases, they didn't hear about the catalogue of issues at the hospital, they didn't hear anything about Catherine de Bager and the confession note, they didn't hear from any medical defence witnesses, they didn't hear the proper context of Lucy's grievance procedure against the consultants, they didn't hear about bacteria present on the unit, in fact they didn't hear about the vast majority of things discussed in this video. The judge of a previous case that primary prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans had been involved with wrote to the Letby trial judge, James Goss, describing the evidence of Evans as worthless among other criticisms. Instead of being thrown out of this hugely important court case, which is what clearly should have happened, Dr. Evans was allowed to continue to give evidence, and the overwhelming majority of medical evidence used in court, 95% would be a conservative estimate, emanated from Dr. Evans, whose evidence had previously been described as worthless. In a recent video, I documented how every single judicial decision related to the court case went against Lucy Letby. Dozens of mainstream publications and hundreds of credentialed people have now spoken out with regard to the Letby case, indicating the likelihood that it is a miscarriage of justice. The official editorial policy at the Daily Telegraph is that events at the Council of Chester should be re-examined, this time ideally by actual scientists, not Dewi Evans and Paul Hughes. Josh Halliday, who reported on the entire court case for The Guardian, has changed his mind from likely guilty to likely innocent on the basis of evidence that has since been uncovered. The Sun newspaper are now campaigning for Lucy's release. The Guardian are very strongly pro-innocence, as are the Mail on Sunday. Dr. Philip Hammond has written an exceptional series of articles for Private Eye, calling on the case to be retried. Even top legal professionals have come forward to assert that this is a highly unsafe conviction that should definitely be re-examined. This has included Lord Ken MacDonald and Supreme Court Judge Lord Jonathan Sumption. There have been several high-profile miscarriages of justice, both recently and historically. The most notable of these has been the post office scandal, which shares one obvious common thread with the conviction of Lucy Letby. There was no money stolen from the post office, and there were no murders at the Council of Chester. Lucy Letby remains incarcerated over crimes that do not exist. I should finally mention that this video doesn't even scratch the surface of the information which points to the conviction of Lucy Letby being chronically unsafe. In my forthcoming book, Reasonable Doubt, Examining the Conviction of Lucy Letby, I examine the full context and background to everything that has occurred at the Countess of Chester Hospital, in court and during the police investigation of Lucy Letby, while interviewing over 60 experts across such specialisms as neonatology, neonatal nursing, paediatrics, obstetrics, vascular surgery, statistics, policing, and many more. Reasonable Doubt will be released on the 9th of July and is published by Sinto Press.